Hi, and welcome to the umpteenth take of the second podcast in the series Realistic Business Forecasting. I'm never going to rival Steven Spielberg in my production and direction qualities, so I hope you'll forgive me. I want to discuss two important issues today. The first is money, which is obviously critical as we're looking at business forecasting. And I want to introduce you to the fictitious company, which I mentioned in the previous podcast, which is Acme Supermarkets. So let's get cracking. Now, first of all, it's important to account for the impact of inflation. If you're of a certain age, you probably remember high levels of inflation in the 1970s. I certainly do. But for a lot of people, inflation of 1-2% has been the norm. It hasn't been the major issue. But now it is important with inflation close to 10% in many parts of the world. So how does this actually affect the way we look at data? Well, let's look at a simple example. The blue line shows the amount of profits you report on an annual basis, and those are the numbers which should appear in the annual reports of your accounts. So you can see that according to those numbers, we've got a steady increase in profit from one year to the next. So it looks good, right? Unfortunately, that is giving a false picture, and let me explain why. If you actually look at profit figures on a like-for-like basis, i.e. constant prices, and here they're all expressed in 2008 prices in the orange line, you can see that profit has in fact been slowly but surely declining. And I've used the UK inflation rates, which you can see at the bottom of this slide. So it's very important to compare like with like when going forward with forecasting. And all figures which I present in these podcasts will be in constant prices. So please bear that in mind as we carry on. So let me introduce you to Acme Supermarket. Now, the data set is available via the website, which is the companion to the book. The reason it's called Art and Science Forecasting rather than Realistic Business Forecasting is that someone stole the original title from my book. But a lot of downloads are available, including the data and many of the models which I'll be presenting in this series of podcasts. So let's actually have a look at an overview of Acme Supermarkets. So here is revenue. And you can see that revenue, all in constant terms, showed a gradual increase up to about 2004, and then declined up to about 2010, not helped for sure by the recession from 2008 to 2011. Then there was some sort of recovery. You can see there's a gradual increase in profitability up to 2018, which is when the data set stops. So this pretty much models what we saw in the supermarket sector as a whole. So I've tried to make this fictional company as realistic as possible. Now, I want to just introduce a very small amount of algebra here. We all know, I hope, that profit is revenue minus cost. But another way of expressing it is that revenue is cost plus profit. And the reason I've done it that way is to reconfigure the previous chart so we can break the chart down into profit and costs. And there are three sorts of costs. We've got staff, cost of goods sold, and energy. So staff costs, you can see, are fairly constant, and costs of goods sold don't move a great deal either, in constant terms. Energy prices, by contrast, have increased significantly compared to what we saw in earlier years. But of course, the major variation we can see is in profit, which is what I wanted to highlight on this chart. And you can see that Acme was making pretty decent profits in the noughties, but during the recession, profit actually went negative in a couple of years, in 2009 and 2011. You can see the little black blocks below the zero line. And since then, profit has recovered, but it's nothing like the levels it was during the noughties. So let's look in a bit more detail at how Acme has been performing. And it's always useful to compare how Acme is doing in relation to competitors. Now, what I've got here are industry sales, and these are real figures. I've used an index of 100 for the first quarter of the year 2000. And you can see that supermarket sales as a whole have been gradually increasing, but not by a huge amount, up to 2018. This is revenue in real terms. However, Acme, while it followed a similar pattern up to about 2005, has underperformed the market since around 2006, and that accelerated during the recession. It's managed to stop the rot to some extent from about 2013, but it is still underperforming the market as a whole. So let's look at some of the other metrics which you can derive from the download, which is available from the website. First, I think it's important to point out this is a pretty small company. We're looking at like 300 to 400 stores. Excuse me. And in 2018, Tesco had 5,700. So we're not looking at a large organization here. You can see they managed to increase the number of stores by about 100 during the noughties. But then with the crisis in profitability, the company decided to have a significant reduction in store numbers. And it's only gradually recovered the number of stores from 2012 up to 2018. The revenue per store obviously fell until they started closing stores. And that was probably one of the factors which drove them to undertake the store closures in the first place. And because the number of stores then closed, presumably the weaker stores were the ones which were removed, the revenue per store has been gradually increasing. Now, let's look at staffing. The number of staff declined somewhat during the first 5 years of the noughties. Perhaps there were productivity gains, new technology, which did not require so many staff. But note that since 2006, the number of staff has remained constant. Note that they kept the number of staff constant even as a number of stores were closed during 2009, 2010. And that could be attributable to a social policy, somewhat like Co-op. Rather than firing staff immediately, they decided to retain staff in the hope that these staff could then be reused once the company recovered. Now, productivity is an important issue. I raised this already during the first podcast. And you can see that as a result of reducing staff, productivity expressed as revenue per employee jumped significantly in the first half of the noughties, stayed constant for a couple of years, but then as revenue started declining and the number of staff remained constant, revenue per employee declined back to 2000 levels. However, since the number of stores started increasing in 2012 and the number of employees stayed the same, revenue per employee went up. So all I wanted to do there was to give you a brief introduction to the company. So do download the data set, have a look at it. derive your own metrics. And what I'm going to be doing in the next podcast is actually examining historical data, what we can derive from it, how we can split out various aspects such as seasonality and trends. For example, in many businesses, you get a seasonal bump during the fourth quarter, which is Christmas. How can we isolate trend from seasonality? That's the sort of issue I'll be covering in the next podcast. So I'll see you then.